Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on your time zone. Doug Robinson, Executive Director of NASCIO, National Association of State Chief Information Officers. And I'm here today joined by my colleague, Alan Shark of Public Technology Institute. Alan and I have been doing this annual forecast now. We just decided this is our 12th year. So it does have some legs. People want to hear this. It does have some longevity, and we're going to bring a lot of information and perspectives and value to you this afternoon. We're going to move quickly through some of our remarks, supported by data from our both sets of surveys that we conduct each year, and provide some trends and perspectives and look at what's the outlook for 2021. And so we'll do that. We are going to leave some time at the end of this webcast for some questions for Q&A in the chat. You have the chat box over on your console in the lower right section. So if you do have questions along the way, please enter those, and we will try to address as many as we can when we get to the completion of our remarks. So I'm going to kick it off looking at the state of the states for 2021. And I'm going to rely on data from many of our national surveys conducted in 2020 and conversations and perspectives, obviously, from our state chief information officers and other state IT leaders. So next, Julie, if we could, we're going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm going to start actually by going to the end of the story and kind of giving you an overview of what we're seeing based on 2020. And both of us obviously will have some remarks about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our respective jurisdictions. But certainly, first and foremost for states, it's going to be about the fiscal impact of the pandemic. It was more dire probably in April or May than it is today in terms of revenue levels, but they're still relatively uncertain. A lot of this has to do with the states. So the 10 largest states all have various degrees of impact. States clearly that rely on travel and leisure like Florida and others. Energy states, those have been more impacted than some of the others. But all states are dealing with constrained budgets. 19 states took mid-year budget cuts, but it's relatively uneven because some of the states had forecasted a 20% or more reduction, have seen that things have rebounded in the fall and they didn't have to make those cuts. So again, very uneven depending on when the state did their budget enactment and the discussions they're having today and what type of draconian cuts they took during the prior fiscal year probably has helped them out because they've been able to recover. So we're going to see some reduced spending levels. Still questions on the table about additional stimulus funding coming out of the pandemic. The last major package did not include flexible aid to states. So that's a concern. We may see that come up with the new Congress. And there's even questions on the table about actually there may be more spend in the IT space because states need to move to more technology, move to automate. So I think we'll see that as depending on the state. So really a lot of this, my comments about budgets and revenue depend on the particular state. And so we're going to cover the rest of these topics as I go through remarks, talk about the business models, talk about the cybersecurity landscape and what we saw during COVID and what we expect in the future. Certainly talk about the challenges around digital services delivery and digital government and what we were seeing during the pandemic and the need both for additional services to be extended to citizens and some of the challenges they had with the platform scaling and being secure for those services. One thing which is really relatively breaking news was the inclusion of the .gov Act and the omnibus funding that was passed by Congress before the end of the year for federal funding. Obviously, that was a Christmas tree kind of bill that had lots of things in it. One of those was a major advocacy item for NASCIO, which is the expansion of .gov and providing some meaningful financial support. So that certainly will help our local government colleagues in the future. We'll be working on helping implement that with our federal partners. We'll talk a little bit about emerging technologies, and then finally just a quick detour here into the state CIO positions. Just so for those of you who are keeping count at home, 18 state CIO transitions in 2020, 25 in 2019. So over the last 24 months, 24 state CIO transitions. So that's pretty remarkable. We try to maintain that continuity of leadership, but with a median tenure right now of about 21 months, it is difficult. We are hoping to see less of that given in 2021, where we know there will only be 2 CIO changes in Montana and Utah. We would expect a few more, but we only have 2 elections in 2021 with Virginia and New Jersey. So again, 2021 should be a little more stable, and we're certainly hoping to see that. Obviously, no one can predict the future on that. So for those of you who want to see that, there's a beautiful color is the heat map of the state transitions with all those in green for 2020. So let's move on and talk about some of the top 10 issues that we're seeing across the states. Each year we do our top 10 State CIO Priorities. This is the 15th year. We celebrate the 15th year anniversary for 2021. We conducted this survey in late 2020, and we asked the state CIOs to forecast and prognosticate what their top priority is going to do, and basically require them to provide a vote on those. We have electronic ballot. Again, we've been doing this for 15 years, so we have some great data, longitudinal data, so we can compare and contrast what we're seeing. A couple of highlights out of the 2021 top 10. Not surprising, cybersecurity and risk management, #1, 8 consecutive years. That's not going to surprise anybody. Digital government remains in a solid #2, and I think, again, this is one we've identified with a COVID-19 impact. The addition of the need to move out of that principle of physicality and face-to-face transactions for citizens, and a much more broad portfolio of digital services being delivered to citizens without that in-person or face-to-face interaction. Cloud remains strong as a major force of change. A couple of things to highlight here: broadband and wireless connectivity, always on the list, but moved up from #9 to #4. Again, we're hearing a lot about broadband, and certainly we'll hear that from our local jurisdictions around broadband as being a much higher priority post-pandemic. Consolidation and optimization was #1 for a number of years, and you see it continues to go down the list. I think more and more states have now achieved that kind of consolidated, perhaps not optimized environment, but their infrastructure consolidation and application rationalization is now a much stronger position and more mature than it was several years ago. A couple of new items: identity and access management, obviously in support of digital services and digital government, is now number 8 on the list, and on the list for the first time. Workforce comes back on the list again, not surprising given what we saw from the pandemic and the impact of remote workforce and work from home. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's go to the next slide and look at some of our data around the recovery and perspectives from our state CIOs. So if you look at just broadly some of the activities that we've seen, obviously for almost now a year, for 10 months, deployment of secure remote access, major IT infrastructure scalability. That was an area that was exposed in terms of being able to scale. We've seen additional cybersecurity risks, particularly around COVID and around the kind of ancillary activities related to COVID, including vaccine distribution and logistics. And we can talk certainly at the end about that. Certainly a stronger support of digital government, particularly the use of automation technology, virtual agents, chatbots. We actually did a nationwide assessment about May of 2020, and you've had this report on the slide, and you can certainly download that. It looks at perspectives. We saw a significant increase in the use of virtual agents and chatbots in robotic process automation during the early parts of the pandemic. States certainly could not support the thousands and literally millions of inbound inquiries, calls, and website information delivered to citizens, so they moved to automated services. We saw obviously the corporate partners really step up and the supply chain for the states and really move to supporting them in their time of need, particularly during the first 4 to 5 months, and scaling up some of these systems, providing them additional support. And the question remains on the table, obviously, is what's going to look like in return from work, and certainly Alan and I can talk about that. What is this going to look like? Will there be a full return to the workplace? In some cases, probably not. States are making decisions today as to what they're going to do, but that has gradually begun in a number of states, and some may not. So let's look at what we saw with COVID-19 and automation, just for a few data points for the next slide. From our survey of the Agile State CIO, and I'm going to rely on this for the next few minutes. This is our 2020 State CIO survey. Went in the field in late spring of 2020. At that point, I think we were all very optimistic, talking about a post-COVID-19 environment, what that world was going to look like. We would not have expected, when we released the survey in mid-October of 2020, with all of the data responses, that we would still be dealing with a global pandemic and certainly the collateral damage of that. And so some of these need to be taken in that context. But we certainly saw was, in terms of automation tools, chatbots, those virtual agents for citizen inquiries, were widely adopted across the states. Many states, as you can see, 3/4 of them introduced these for the first time. Our previous data from surveys showed there was interest, but state CIOs and others were looking for a strong business case to deploy these kind of low-level components of artificial intelligence or automated intelligence, and they certainly found it with the need to support citizen inquiries, both on the web for those filing claims for unemployment, as well as certainly call centers. Call centers had to ramp up dramatically. And again, mobile apps, voice bots to support call center action. So you see some of the highlights of where automation was brought to bear because of the need to support the COVID-19 response from state governments. So let's look at the next set of data around what we've seen from other surveys. In the next slide, we partnered up with IBM and the Center for Digital Government on a second part of our artificial intelligence examination, and we looked at how AI technology was supporting digital government with this report, Digital Government Rising. This was a set of interviews across the states of a number of state CIOs where they looked at current use cases and use cases under review. And again, you can see that chatbots were at the top of the list, both for help desk and for call centers to support citizen interaction, as well as to support capabilities internal to state government. And so you can see some of these other activities, things like resource scheduling and optimization and cybersecurity threat assessments. That's where AI already has a foothold within the states, and you can see some of the use cases that are under review. So again, if you want more detail about perspectives of a number of state CIOs on AI, and that includes machine learning, robotic process automation, all the whole stack of what I would call the automated intelligence stack. You can see all of that in that report, which is available on the NASCIO website. So let's look at the next slide to talk about from the perspective of COVID-19 and the pandemic, what will change in 2021? We asked our CIOs to kind of rank order what they thought in terms of the business processes, practices, and investments that will change in kind of a post-COVID-19 world. Again, this is from our 2020 survey. And so you kind of look, and not surprising, you see expanded work from home capabilities and work options, bringing those collaboration technologies to bear to be able to have that interaction, remote meetings, bring teams together, be able to interview and work with citizens in a virtual and a video world, and we're seeing more and more of that. Again, all this has now become almost standard fare within state government agencies and those lines of business that are serving citizens and working internally on their teams. Increased attention on digital government, number 2 on our high priority list, and here number 3 from the CIOs. Investments in broadband, certainly an area. These 2 areas were both clearly exposed, along with number 5, which was legacy platforms and legacy modernization. All 3 of those exposed during the pandemic as needing support, stability, investment. They did not operate as advertised, and so we saw some of the holes. I think particularly for citizens, it was around inability to have broadband access at their homes for both work and for K through 12 and higher education. So again, you can see some of the others that all fell out. This was a forced choice ranking, so we asked them to pick their top 5, and you can see those, and I think they're again generally accepted across the board. They're very. So let's look at the next set of data around some of the topics. I'm going to hit these quickly about the next slide on cybersecurity. So I'm going to hit each of the top 10 with some supporting data from our annual survey and perspectives from our other surveys with our partners of state government leaders. And so certainly the first and foremost is around cybersecurity. We've been asking this set of cybersecurity kind of maturity metrics for over 10 years. And so again, we have a lot of longitudinal data on how states are moving from advancing the ball, so to speak, in cybersecurity. So these are just a set of measures. It's not again, a formalized capability and maturity model, but a set of indicators that would give you a perspective on where states fall. And where we've seen these are relatively stable, particularly around cybersecurity awareness training for workers and contractors, again, at the 96 to 98% level consistently. Continuous vulnerability and scanning technologies and endpoint detection and other technologies, again, high percentages. Trusted partnerships, adopting a framework. So again, you can see all these are above 3/4 of the states have all moved in that direction. One of the things we've been tracking for a number of years is cybersecurity liability insurance. That started out at about 5 states, about 10%. And you can see now that that a little more than half the states have obtained cybersecurity insurance. So again, we'll continue to assess these and monitor, but it gives you a good sense of where states are making their investments and how they're moving and advancing the ball in terms of their cybersecurity posture within the state with some of these policies and some of these investments. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at some data from our 2020 Deloitte NASCIO cybersecurity study. Again, this is the kind of preeminent study on cybersecurity in the states. It's done on a biennial basis. We survey all of the chief information security officers in the state CISOs. This year we had all of them respond to this survey, 51, remarkable response rate, and we've got a great set of data. I'm only going to supply you with a couple of points I think that are germane. One was clear is that the COVID-19 pandemic just simply widened the cybersecurity challenges of budget and talent and the increasing sophistication of the threats. And certainly one of those is when you went to remote posture. If you look at the data about what percentage of the workforce were remote before COVID, many states did not have a remote work or work from home policy. They didn't have that in place. If they did, at least they were in better situation when they had to move to remote work, and which was done in some cases in a matter of just a few days in a number of states. You can see that in some cases, almost a quarter of the states, 90% of the employees were working from home. So that created a whole set of new security challenges and safeguards that had to be put in place. And again, you can see the list on the slide of the points that the CISOs wanted to bring up, particularly around the use of things like multi-factor authentication, the expansion of VPN services. Were states that had to do up to 10x expansion of their current VPN environment to be able to provide secure, trusted connections back into the state services from a state employee perspective that were now working, at home. Again, a lot of potential threats, a lot of potential activities that all the states saw from threat actors when they moved folks to work from home. And we saw this across the states, as well as making sure that they were continually updating all their services and doing the patching while we had remote access. And that, again, exceedingly difficult to do across the states when you have tens of thousands of state employees working from their home office, working from their bedroom, working from some detached garage. Made it increasingly difficult for them to make sure that they were minimizing potential threats. So if we could look at the next set of data around budgets and funding and some of the top challenges, these have been consistent. We are asking the CISOs since 2010, what are the top barriers around their cybersecurity? Cybersecurity budget and funding has been number one for almost all of these surveys, and certainly inadequate staffing and the inability to be able to attract and retain qualified cybersecurity professionals with the state is really difficult. But two things: one is the actual cybersecurity budget, and the other is the lack of a dedicated budget. Only 18 states actually have cybersecurity budget that's dedicated. A lot of it comes out of the chargeback model that many CIO organizations use. So it's very difficult. As you can see from the average cybersecurity spend in 2020, it's moved a little bit, but again, it tends to be in that 1 to 3% of the total IT budget across the board. 2% would be a good midpoint on that. And again, that is fairly consistent for most state governments. So as you can see, comparing and contrasting to the federal government or private sector counterparts, it is clearly inadequate given the level of threats and the increasing sophistication of the threats and the threat actors, particularly nation states that have sophisticated adversaries. And so states, that's number one of our advocacy campaign, is really try to get greater understanding of the need for resources. It's about the continuity of state government. It's about a business risk to the state. And again, that's part of our campaign, is both for states to increase their budgets on cyber and also to look for federal support. So You'll hear more of that in 2021 from NASCIO. So again, moving from cyber, let's wrap up and look at a couple of the other top 10 topics. Again, number 2 on the list, digital government services, and not surprisingly, what's the biggest driver there for state CIOs is a better online experience, almost universal. The comparing online experiences of citizens to their state government as they deal with other as a consumer in the marketplace with other online experiences, it just doesn't measure up. And so they're really looking for that. And clearly more and more citizens now are conducting business online, and they're able to compare and contrast their online consumer experience with what happens when they deal with the state, which can often be fragmented, often can be difficult to navigate. The user experience is not as seamless as you would expect to see it from large organizations. So again, optimizing that, lowering costs, introducing identity and access management solution, getting, again, a more seamless experience across all agencies, all that is challenging and something that they would like to address. They have seen their digital transformation efforts bear some fruit, but again, I think it's still to be determined in a lot of states. This is one area that probably has not lived up to the great promise of more than a decade ago of digital government. So states are really pushing this and investing in this. We're hearing governors talk more about this today in this pandemic world, so that's important. If you could look at the next set of data around cloud, again, number 3 on the top 10 list, and we have some data in all of our surveys around cloud, and with our state CIO survey, along with Grant Thornton and CompTIA each year, we ask a set of questions for the last decade around cloud migration. Almost half the states have a kind of a cloud migration strategy in place. They're addressing their portfolio. They're making wise decisions. We've heard the term cloud smart. They're looking across the board from an architecture perspective. But I thought you might like to see cloud adoption priorities as ranked by the states. So we asked the states with a long pick list, the state CIOs, to ask them what categories were their top priorities. And again, here's the top 12 on the list. The one that I would highlight is disaster recovery. It has moved up the list, and I think, again, a reflection of COVID on the impact of that, more cloud services and the cloud platforms that were brought to bear because they provided that scalability and flexibility that states needed. And so they're going to be looking for this. That's going to be clearly part of the business model of the future, is higher degrees of cloud adoption and third-party cloud services. So as we're talking about that, let's talk about the CIO business model on the next slide. And that really is, again, a set of longitudinal data that we've been tracking and looking at a set of questions around where is the state business model and how the state CIO plan to deliver, the set of IT services over the next 3 years. And so this gives you a good kind of projection into what we're seeing. And these have been moving in this direction for a number of years, which you can see in the expansion mode. So what you're not seeing, again, is states are not building new data centers. They're not expanding their data centers. If anything else, they're moving into outside data centers, or they're making their footprint smaller and they're optimizing their environment. They're also, as you can see from the numbers, they're not greatly expanding IT staff, and they're going to be in maintenance mode, or they're expect to downsize. And so we've seen this trend continue over the last several years. I think the one thing I would point out is, again, the as a service model in terms of particularly software as a service acquisition. 89% of our respondents indicated that they expect that to expand. And again, so we're seeing this move to the CIO as broker model with more multi-supplier initiatives, more managed services, more outsourcing and contracting to private sector providers, particularly those cloud services. And so as we see major shift to large applications like ERPs and the budget and finance and accounting and procurement, states moving those to now available cloud services. And we're going to see more and more of that, I think, over the next several years as they begin to move off of the legacy environment and the on-premise solutions, and again, move more to off-premise and cloud-based solutions to serve their states. So you'll see these numbers continue to grow as they move to more outsourcing and managed service models. So if we could look at the last couple of data points I want to cover, one around broadband, which I mentioned as being a high priority. You see the ranking from our state CIOs on the top 5 most important elements. Again, not surprising is funding. We've seen a fairly dramatic amount of the CARES funding that governors wanted to dedicate to broadband expansion and be able to bring broadband to rural areas and urban areas as well, because there's definitely a digital divide that remains in this country, and so they want to particularly address that. A huge part of that is affordability. It's not just access, and it's not just the service being provided. It's the service is not being provided at an affordable rate in many cases, and states are going to have to address that. So you might have it available, it might be accessible, but it's not affordable to citizens. So that's a policy issue that has to be addressed, and you can see that reflected here. And one important technical point is on the mapping and the data, and I think that's where we'll see some potentially federal changes. We have states already that have decided to move off on their own and take a different approach and a different methodology about the mapping data down to the address level. One thing you should know is that the state CIOs in many states, as you can tell from that question here, are not potentially the leader of their broadband initiatives. Only less than a quarter of them are actually leading strategic planning or the operational part. Many broadband agencies in the states are within the economic development or the community development organizations within the state and not under the direct purview of the state CIO, although as you can see, 3/4 of them are members of that team and provide them leadership advice on the broadband topic. So. And let's finally wrap up with the discussion on emerging technology and what we're going to see on the horizon with the next slide. I've already mentioned the adoption of the AI kind of stack, particularly around chatbots and robotic process automation. We certainly expect this to grow. We anticipate that this will continue to grow, particularly as we've had states that have adopted multiple chatbot solutions, or at least a portfolio of chatbot utilization within various state agencies, and they've got experience now on the ground. They've seen the benefits. We've seen that expansion already. So we'd expect that to grow. As you can see, that number of a ranking by the state CIOs has continued to go up from 30+% just a few years ago now to 61. New to the list is low code, no code apps development. And again, I see that growing as well. A lot of interest in that. We did some conference sessions on low code, no code, and it really moved up very, very quickly. It kind of rocketed up to number 2. What we haven't heard much about in the last years, things like blockchain and IoT, I suspect that simply is because it's embedded and it's become ubiquitous and it's not considered that emerging anymore within state government. It's just part of the infrastructure and part of their physical network deployment. And so it doesn't seem to be as impactful, at least on their perspective in this particular survey that we did in 2020. So let me end with a quick outlook, and then I'll turn it over to Alan for the local government perspective. When you kind of look at what we're looking at for 2021, I've already covered a number of these topics, so I thought I'd just reiterate some of the things that we're seeing, particularly in the broadband space. I would point out on cybersecurity, we've already had briefing sessions around the concern about the IT supply chain. You know what's going on with the kind of the hack in both the federal, state, and local sector on that. But I think more importantly is that there's some concern about potential cybersecurity vulnerabilities with supply chain, with the vaccine distribution, potential nation-state disruption of vaccine logistics and inventory. So that's something we're going to keep an eye on. It's already been kind of discussed at the federal level. And certainly with the new federal administration coming on board here in just a few days and a new Congress that has been seated, we would expect some policy shifts and some funding priorities. We've obviously begun to weigh in with NASCIO's perspective on that. We have our advocacy priorities will be released later this week, which will address a number of those. And again, we would like to see more attention on some of these state challenges and things like FCC reforms on broadband. We would expect, hopefully, with a new FCC being seated, the new members of the FCC, that we would have a different perspective on broadband that might be a little more accommodating to state and local governments. So those are some of the things we're looking at. Next slide is just a wrap up, and we'll go to Alan. It's just if you're interested in any of this data that I've talked about and provided color commentary on, all of these reports are available free from the NASCIO website. I know Alan will have his own reports as well, but you can download these at your leisure. So now on to Dr. Alan Shark. He's Executive Director and CEO of the Public Technology Institute, now unit of CompTIA. And so, Alan, I know you've got a lot of great data around local governments, and we can wrap it up with some Q&A at the end if we've got some time. On to you, sir.
Cool. All right, Doug. You know, having done this with you for so many years, the one thing that I see as a trend is we have far more in common in terms of our respective memberships than ever before. The goals really do line up very, very well. And so it's really a pleasure to do this once again. 12 years, it's amazing. And both of us, I want to recognize the fact both of us have been at the helm of our respective organizations for 16 plus years. So we look forward to this every year. We're going to do a mid-year kind of checkup in July. So we look forward to that and see how well we're doing. You know,
Alan,
the business
I still have brown hair, see, don't I? I still have brown hair. I don't know what's going on with you, but we're getting younger.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's those virtual screens and virtual makeup. Got it. The business of government continues. You know, I look at published data from 2020, and when you look at state and local IT spend, it's over $110 billion. If I was to look at just local government, it's $54.4 billion. State government spending $56.6 billion. That's last year. Now, some people say, well, there could be a little bit of fall off. This is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and it's really becoming no less important, as you'll see in some of the trends. So what I like to do is I just have to acknowledge the fact that we're acting as if things are normal. This is just one of 12 years worth of presentations. You know, we're facing a great crisis. And the way I see things, that's setting the stage for what I'm about to present, CIOs, Chief Information Officers, local, state, even federal, we're all facing three epidemics. The first one is COVID. And we're hoping that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're all waiting for those shots, and they will come. So I'm optimistic. The second epidemic is the rise in cyber threats. That continues every single year, manifested by our people are on guard all the time, trying to keep up with people who have nothing else to do but to exploit the systems that we try to maintain. The third one, which is kind of interesting, is misinformation. That is a third epidemic that we face. And here we are, Chief Information Officers. And for democracy, the public has to trust their government. Now, the good news is they trust locals and state governments far more than any other branch. So that's good. We are the front lines that interact with people, but it's been a tough year. And I don't have all the answers, but as Chief Information Officers, we have to guard that information from a cybersecurity to administer all these new programs to help people who are really needy, and somehow to figure out how to counteract this misinformation plague that is really harming all of us, all sides. So with that, I'm going to address some of the issues moving forward that I guess you could look at from two different perspectives. The first is I'm going to give you and share with you the 2021 outlook for cities and counties. Now, this is based on my research, looking at many great wizards that have all sorts of prognostications that started way into the end of last year into this year. And I kind of took all of that, plus our survey data, I kind of put it together into some trends that I see moving forward. So this is kind of synopsis of what we see. And then I'm going to talk about our data from our preliminary research that we do with CompTIA. And for many of you, it's been 2 years now since PTI is fully enmeshed with CompTIA, and we couldn't be happier. It's a great partner. So we are very, very proud to be part of that and carry the flag as well. So the first one is cybersecurity focus intensifies. This, Doug mentioned that this goes back, I think, leading the list for the last 8 years. I would say at least the same for us, if not more so, again, being on the front lines. Cybersecurity focus intensifies because we have to. The growth in ransomware attacks continues, and it becomes more perplexing. And while more and more localities are turning to cyber insurance, one has to wonder sometimes, is cyber insurance actually becoming more of a target? Because if cyber insurance companies are more willing to pay out, does this signal possible targets for those who have it versus those who have not? Because some of these local governments don't have the way to pay some of these unbelievable ransomware demands. And when it began, say 7 years ago, it was $250, $500. Now we're talking about 6 figures and more. So the concern continues, and we're finding new ways to kind of protect the data, to protecting our citizens and the business of government. The second one that we see is managed services will most likely grow. And the reason why we see this is the fact that so many local governments are under the gun to be able to do so many things with less resources. We know that the tax revenues have not fully been felt in terms of declines, which we all anticipate in 2021. We have enjoyed the CARES funding and other targeted funding, but I think 2021 is going to be the year when it could be something that akin to 2008 and 2009. It's going to force more governments to figure out, does it make sense to do all these things ourselves, or should we turn to managed service providers who might be able to do a better job, possibly at a less cost, because they can amortize a larger infrastructure over many clients and local governments that may help. So I have talked to a number of city and county managers who are looking at that, not to get rid of their core groups by any means, but if push comes to shove, this is becoming a much more important option to explore. The third one is no surprise here. The stature of the CIO has clearly risen, and that rising has brought forth most of the technology enterprise within local governments, both cities and counties and townships across the country. This has been a long time coming, and it took an epidemic pretty much to kind of show what these people have. The great pivot of March of 2020 really was all the proof that one needed to be able to move to a total virtual environment in just days or weeks. And I have to give shout out to the vendor community. I have never seen greater cooperation, bending backwards to work with our local governments. I'm sure the same is true with state governments, to help them to come up with solutions, to donate equipment, donate personal time, finding ways to get equipment and software in the hands of local governments. That we're facing an emergency, and now this so-called emergency is playing out and maybe long-term. So everywhere I turn, elected leaders, senior public managers are realizing how important the CIO, and that's going to come back later in one of my other points. The next one is, just like with the state CIOs, the citizen-centric focus continues to grow. The citizen is so important. They're not just a customer. They're a citizen. And I use that term generically as in the case of a stakeholder as opposed to a consumer. This is really important both as a concept and as a set of strategies to make people feel that they are part of this enterprise. It's more than just paying taxes once or twice a year, but that the government is there to serve them, provide vital services, and to enable input from citizens and get things done, especially at a time when it may not be practical to go to a physical office. So this virtualization, this digitalization continues to grow and will continue to grow, and people like it. They like the convenience. In fact, when we look at public meetings, they have grown exponentially because it's more accessible, it's easier, and many of our local governments have come up with very clever ways to address the citizens in terms of providing them platforms and forums to come in and testify remotely or to weigh in. So it's actually been a good thing, even though I wouldn't wish it the way it has come out. The number 5 is remote work becomes permanent. We have a lot of people who balked at this, say, oh, I really like the office. And there are people who still miss the office. I'm one of them. Do I want to be there 5 days a week? No, but I do miss the physical interaction with staff. And I think we will see hybrids down the road, but the reward, and that's why I use the word options, remote work options become permanent, both from a public safety, from a all hazards approach, having people used to working at home and can conduct most of their activities in such a way, and if not with even greater accuracy and greater productivity, is a good thing. So we believe that this is going to kind of be a new way in which we govern. Number 6 is the future of the office, which is clearly related, is changed forever. We have a lot of city and county managers saying, you know, I was thinking of expanding. We're growing and we need more space. Suddenly that's kind of being re-examined. Do we really need new space, or do we need to use our space better? My vision and what I'm hearing from people is that more offices will accommodate more shared type offices. So that if I'm coming to work, I take my name tag, put it in, and I have that office for the hour, for the day, possibly even for the week. But when I leave, it's somebody else's. And it's scheduled in such a way that enables other people to come into the office and share and be productive, have those staff meetings. But do we need all the different spaces that we have today? Many public managers are rethinking, saying probably not. So the next one is really kind of interesting, and it's been touched upon in many of our surveys of the past, but it really came home this time with number 7, which is broadband expansion and affordability and accessibility has got to be addressed. This pandemic has really exposed some of the weaknesses in how we get information in the hands of our citizens and our students. Many of our localities work with school systems, are part of school systems, and they have an enormous challenge, as you've read. What kinds of equipment do students need to be able to work effectively at home? And the broadband that used to work for 1 or 2 on occasion, is it good for a family of many? Competing demands on broadband for homework, for work, for social media, for other kinds of broadband usage, it becomes quite a strain. And we're hearing a lot of folks who have lived in the suburbs or unserved areas that have the means, but just don't have the availability. So this has become a real problem. The digital divide has been exposed further. And governments have already begun trying to address these needs, both from the worker standpoint, the citizen standpoint, and the student standpoint, because if we're going to go virtual and we're going to go remote, we've got to do more. Number 8 is greater local state collaboration, especially in cybersecurity. I know that NASCIO, with all the wonderful reports they've done, did a beautiful report at the beginning of last year with the National Governors Association on state and local government cooperation. We have championed that with NASCIO, and we believe there's greater opportunities, and we see that coming from state CIOs as well. Many of the local government CIOs say, I don't even know who my state CIO is. I don't know how to reach them. I don't know what they do. At the same time, the surveys show at the state end, state CIOs do offer services. So there's a disconnect. And I think NASCIO and PTI have more work to do. And I know the willingness is there to kind of figure out ways to strengthen collaboration between state and local government. But I do see a great opening and a great opportunity. Number 9 has been touched upon in Doug's slides, and I just want to emphasize it's also happening and quite prevalent at the local level. Emerging tech will continue to grow in state and local government. We're seeing that in artificial intelligence. We're seeing it in chatbots or voice bots, and it's growing. Up to date, this is augmented systems to help augment the employees, providing coverage where we can't provide 24/7 coverage, taking care of those repetitive calls coming in, screening calls or texts coming in, so that the time that the professionals have can be better spent troubleshooting once we know what it is that we're trying to troubleshoot. We do see blockchain growing. We see it in offices of lands and deeds. It's not as glamorous. It doesn't get all the attention, but I see that growing in the next year or two, because it is an interesting and secure means of better protecting data in a database environment. Number 10, now this is interesting. Digital infrastructure will eclipse physical infrastructure. It's not going to replace it. It just means that more attention has to be placed on digital infrastructure in terms of our networks, our broadband, our fiber networks, all the systems that it takes to run the operations of government. And while the roads and bridges are far more visible, we know based on the demands placed on our system with an unemployment claims, with COVID information, that our systems have really been pushed to the limits. And so much more has to be invested in digital infrastructure. And so hopefully we can work together in identifying and prioritizing what those elements shall be. Number 11, kind of somewhat related, is microtransportation grows as well as flexible service options. We're seeing some real interesting solutions, whether it be scooters or how we're having systems on demand for our seniors and those with physical disabilities being taken to doctor's appointments, getting their prescriptions filled on demand as opposed to maintaining expensive fleets. Not to replace them, but to augment them. So we're coming up with some very clever means of transportation, getting people from point A to point B, including, getting back to number 10, autonomous vehicles. They are coming. They're already on campuses, colleges across the country. Students at the university where I teach can order pizza and these little robots will come rolling to their dorms, delivering their food or supplies. It's already here and it will continue to expand. And number 12, recent experience with the Great Pivot should secure improved tech funding for years to come. Now, this is a relatively optimistic approach. And the reason why I say it is, in the past, we've had the so-called democratic type of procedures. We're going to do a 10% across the board cut. I think based on the worth of technology, the value of technology, we're going to see less of that. We're going to see more targeted cuts, which is probably better news for technology, because technology by and large slowly has been moving much more to a pay-as-you-go environment, which we call OpEx, meaning that more expenditures are placed in the operating budget under contracts. Email, managed services. You don't pay your bills, you don't get your service, you don't get your updates, you could lose your data. So the old days of capitalizing equipment and things and systems were terrific. They still exist, but less so. And so the idea of putting maintenance off, putting those upgrades off are going to be much more difficult in the time ahead. So let's move to the next area of my quick presentation, and then I will open it up with Doug for Q&A. I'll move through this fairly quickly. The slides will be available to all. I just want to highlight 5 areas. This is from our 2021 survey that is still being processed, but the 5 areas are CIO technology priorities over the next 5 years, budget expectations, top priorities for bridging workforce skill gaps, cybersecurity priorities, and impact of COVID. The first one, if I can, is the cybersecurity survey for the next 12 years. So if I could have the next slide. What we see here is that cybersecurity is number 1. Look, by what a margin, 86%. Innovation falls to 49, and then launching or updating digital services for citizens, 47. Part of that is because they've already done it, but continue to do it. But these are the breakouts, and then of course modernizing outdated IT systems, 45%. Next slide, please. So when it comes to budget expenditures, the point I want to make here is that 50% of city county CIOs expect their IT budgets to increase in the next fiscal year. I was surprised when I saw that, but in talking to them, they feel relatively optimistic that there's such a strong buy-in from senior managers and elected leaders that they're less worried than they were in 2008 and 2009. So we shall see. The next slide, please, gets into staff skills. Obviously, cybersecurity. I'm going to focus more on the right side. Soft skills keeps coming up. You know, there's this old adage that says, when it comes to technology, you're hired for your technology knowledge, but you're fired for your lack of soft skills and leadership. And that's why PTI with CompTIA have spent a lot of time fortifying our soft skills through our CIO and digital service professional certifications, and that will continue. They want to train people to better understand cloud integration and infrastructure and digital transformation, and of course, infrastructure and crisis management. Next slide, please. That gives you a sense on the skill sets. When it comes to priorities on the many fronts, training for general staff, I'm going to look at the darker colors, 54%. Further establishing security mindset, that's awareness, 46%. Modernizing defenses, 41. adopting cybersecurity framework. Again, cybersecurity, these are all the breakouts of the concern that cities and counties and townships across the country have with cybersecurity. The next slide talks about COVID real quick. Certainly it has expanded remote work by 92%. That's a lot in a short amount of time. It expanded the use of collaboration platforms, remote meetings, 92%. Investments in virtual digital services for citizens, 51%. These, in many cases, were not budgeted items. Investments in business continuity and operational resilience, 39%. And changes to local government facilities, reduction of office space and configuration, 34%. My final slide, I just like to remind folks to keep abreast of what we're doing every week, 50 weeks a year. We come up with our Tech Matters. We have lots of other research and publications. You can check us out at pti.org, but do subscribe to Tech Matters. Go to our website, look for Tech Matters, subscribe. There's no cost. And it really is a great weekly read. It comes out every Wednesday. What's going on, where, and it gives you a quick synopsis, and it will take you to the original story. So that's my quick synopsis. I know I had to go through this fairly quickly. The slide deck is available. We will be publishing our data. Doug, we can now answer a few questions.
Thank you, Alan. Julie, do we have any questions in the queue? I need to look at the chat over here. I'm not sure I see any. There we go. There's one. Okay. For broadband, let's see, broadband deployment, I have a question. The governor's NCO is looking to use, this is basically pandemic money, fiber copper replacement. I don't see that in terms of expediting the deployment. I think it's major capital expenditures. Some states are focused on middle mile, but a lot of them obviously look at that last mile issue. But I think in rural areas, there's also a lot of discussions around satellite technology to meet that need in the rural area. So clearly, long-term switch is going to be to fiber, but that's not necessarily appropriate. The cost and certainly the capital investment required from the carriers, I think that's going to be one of the major problems. The other is there is obviously a significant difference between how states are looking at their broadband gap at the state level vis-a-vis what the FCC is reporting with their census tract data. So we've seen some, I think, real advanced states that are looking at this and bringing up their own address level mapping, which takes, they're looking at literally millions of address points and trying to deploy that to make their switch more effective from an investment standpoint. But that's a continuing debate. There's been some very good reports released in 2020 around what states have really moved forward in terms of broadband deployment, and there were two factors that really drove, well, actually, well, three. One was governance. One was that there was a state level committee, a state level task force or council that actually was working with the various local governments and other providers and the carriers. The other thing was there was some level of state funding. The third, interesting enough, was that the states that continue to have anti-muni broadband bills are seeing less and less of that. So that becomes a challenge in whether or not state legislators are going to take that on. We've got 20 states that prohibit municipal organizations and municipal cable and utility companies from deploying broadband. And they actually found that that's a detriment, obviously, to service. So I'm not going to get into the debate on that, but there's lots of new studies out there that were taking place in 2020. I think we'll see more of that evidence.
If I could, I always look at broadband as a local issue primarily. And I have to say that when it came to CARES funding, many of our localities did use that to enhance their broadband offerings to the public, or at least to their infrastructure. So that was kind of interesting to see how they did it. But the one thing that we kept hearing was that they didn't have enough time, because this is not something you can just write a check, build a tower, and build the infrastructure. And as you know, the last go around really didn't help local governments very much. In fact, the most they got was thanks to NASCIO for the .govs. localities who don't have .gov could actually have $400 saved through this act.
Yeah.
That's all that came out of this new thing. So I'm hoping with the new administration that cities and counties receive more funding, and I think local governments are better prepared now, based on their experiences from last year, to invest more in broadband, and do so hopefully in a more reasonable amount of time. I mean, people are sweating in December, get that tower up regardless of the snow or whatever. So they're on it, and we'll see. Again, it's going to require some external funding.
Yeah. We've got a question about extended length of the pandemic, a new round of budget shortages on state and local government. It's hard to determine now. Because every state has different impacts on this. Certainly some of the largest states, Florida, New York, California, are having more extended fiscal issues, and it's going to go through 2023, 2024. I would point you to the NASBO report. The fiscal expenditures and the fiscal studies report just came out in mid-December, has a tremendous amount of data around each state, as well as aggregate reports, and a really nice 5 or 6 page summary that give you the perspective. And it does depend. But Al, what are you hearing from locals?
I'm hearing that they're very worried about the budget coming up. In other words, the governments always lag because the crisis occurs just like in 2008, 2009. It's 6 months to a year later when the impact hits. And if there's no new infusion of state and federal dollars, localities are totally exposed. Less people working, less people paying taxes. It can be very severe. They're already eliminating many positions through attrition, and they are prepared to go further.
Yeah. 2 final questions real quick. This kick one to you, Alan, on low code, no code. Do you see that as being a discussion in local governments today?
Just starting to hear it. So this is kind of new. I think we want to look more into it and further that discussion. But that's kind of one of the newer things on the horizon for sure.
Yeah. I definitely see we've got a number of states that have made a serious move toward developing that. But they probably have more, I would call business analyst expertise and business level technical expertise that not necessarily are application programmers, but can use the low code tools to be able to build modules, so that they have pre-configured modules and containers that they can utilize for some of those business functions. So we're certainly seeing that in a number of states and kind of the post-COVID world. Last question is really around the surveys talked about work from home and what tools and access tools and applications were deployed. And we have a breakdown of that. We do not have a breakdown of that in our data, but we did ask obviously our CIOs what they saw as obviously the beginning implications of what the trends were. It was clearly a lot about, number one, security. So there were a number of tools deployed for security for the first time. Many states were moving into dual factor and multi-factor technology. All of them were deploying VPN for a wide range of services. They weren't allowing split tunneling, and they were really locking the endpoints down because they saw those as vulnerabilities. So I think there were two real, the emphasis was on security side, and the other would be on the virtual collaboration space, which many state employees had not used previously. So you saw a big rollout of the use of Microsoft Teams, the use of video, the use of Google Meets, and any of the other collaboration forms. Clearly the major ones like Zoom and this one, go to Webinar and GoToMeeting, which we've all been using to the point of exhaustion. That has now been deployed down to the rank and file state employees. So they've become skilled at using those, which I think bodes well for the future, because I think they can be very effective in bringing disparate groups together. So that's kind of major things that we saw: security side and then collaboration platforms.
The only thing I would add to your list, it would be the whole issue of the citizen weighing in and being part of public meetings and not being able to be there in person. That is huge. And they've come up with some very clever workarounds for that. Part of it is, the help desk has had to expand their services into the night. Like, my modem doesn't work. What do I do? So it's kind of challenging.
Yeah. One thing it just struck me too, that I've certainly seen we've actually had to answer some questions from a number of our members on the legal standing, but I would point to digital signature technology and you point citizen interaction platforms have been really probably from a work from home perspective. I think we've seen a broader adoption of that legally state employees and state agencies could always do it, but now we're seeing a broader expansion of those tools being able to allow folks to sign digitally and return that. So from a state internal perspective, you've got HR capabilities now where you were going to require people to sign in person of some paper form, and now they're doing it via electronic signature software, and they have the same legal standing, so they're finding that much more streamlined. So again, I think these are the things that will probably stick in the future that they may have been hesitant to deploy just a year ago. So there's some positives that will come out of all of this. Well, we have exhausted our time, Alan, and I think again, look at the some of the future activities that Alan and I both talked about, some of the trends for NASCIO. I think just coming up the latter part of this week, we hope on Thursday we'll be releasing our 2021 federal advocacy priorities. Obviously, these are directed at the NASCIO's top priorities from our executive committee, directed at the new administration, new Congress, new executive branch leadership, and we're also we're crafting a white paper, NASCIO's position paper for the new administration and new Congress. So, but again, look on Thursday for that. That's our major piece for the rest of this week. Alan, anything else you'd like to add before we sign off for the day?
No, I just said our research report will come out in the coming weeks, and that will give even more data to many of the points that I raised here. Just like Doug, we have great research in both of our websites. It's both PTI and CompTIA and RN, and of course CompTIA works with NASCIO in some of their research, which is important. And then there's the podcast that we do, Shark Bites, where we do some really interesting interviews wherever you get your podcasts. A name like mine is a terrible thing to waste, so I have to put a plug in for that.
Yeah, good plug. It is good. So it's great title for a podcast too. We appreciate that, Alan. Appreciate you and my colleagues there at PTI. Again, we thank you all, most importantly, several hundred attendees today that tuned in to hear our annual forecast each year. And stay tuned. We're going to come back in, I think, in July and mid-year and provide some additional perspectives on what we were seeing as we get through the first 6 months of 2021. We'll see lots of developments we'll be able to talk about. So thank you very much for your attendance, and have a great rest of the day for all of you.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.